There are mornings that feel different before you can explain why. That Tuesday was one of them. It was just past 5 in the morning when the knocking started. Not frantic, not loud, just deliberate. 3 slow knocks, the kind that don't ask for permission so much as announce that something has already been decided. I remember standing in the hallway in my socks, one hand on the wall, listening, trying to decide if I had imagined it. I hadn't. My name is Alyssa Rowan. I'm 33 years old. I work as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in the city. I live alone in a house I inherited from my grandmother. A quiet street, mature trees, neighbors who wave but don't intrude. It's a life I built carefully, deliberately, the kind of life where 5 a.m. knocking doesn't happen. When I opened the door, my neighbor Gabriel was standing on the porch. I had spoken to him maybe a dozen times in the year since he moved in. He was quiet, polite, the type who keeps his yard clean and his curtains closed. I knew almost nothing about him, but I knew what fear looked like on a person. And that morning, it was all over him. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't explain himself. He just said, quietly and without any decoration, "Don't go to work today. Stay home, please." I asked him why. He said he couldn't tell me yet, that I would understand by noon. Then he walked back to his house without looking back. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. The sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler was running. Everything looked exactly the way it always did. I went inside, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. I did not dismiss what he said. I had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the quietest warnings are often the ones most worth hearing. I texted my manager, "Personal emergency, won't be in today." Then I waited. Waiting is its own kind of work. I didn't pace. I didn't call anyone. I made a second cup of coffee and sat near the window where I could see the street without being seen. It's a habit I didn't know I had developed until that morning, when I noticed myself doing it without thinking. The hours moved slowly. Nothing happened. By mid-morning, I had almost convinced myself that Gabriel had been confused, that whatever he feared had passed, or had never existed at all. I thought about sending a follow-up text to my manager, maybe offering to join the afternoon calls remotely. I thought about all the small, ordinary things I was missing by being home. Then, at 11:47, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. The voice on the other end was calm and measured, the practiced calm of someone trained to deliver difficult information without reaction. He identified himself as a county police officer. He asked if I was aware of an incident at my workplace that morning. I told him I wasn't. That I had been home all day. There was a pause. He told me that a serious event had occurred at my building, that my key card had been used to access the 3rd floor at 8:02 that morning, that security footage showed my vehicle entering the parking garage, that colleagues had reported seeing me arrive. I sat very still. I told him clearly that none of that was possible, that I had not left my house. He asked if anyone could confirm that. I live alone. There was no one. What followed was not an accusation, not directly, but the shape of it was unmistakable. Items belonging to me had been recovered near the scene. My presence had been logged, time-stamped, documented. In the eyes of every system that morning, I had been there. Someone had built a version of me and sent her into that building. I asked about the footage, whether they could see who had actually stepped out of the vehicle. He told me the relevant portion was corrupted. I set the phone down on the table after the call ended and looked at my hands. They were steady. That surprised me. But somewhere beneath the steadiness, something had shifted. A quiet recognition that this was not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself with a phone call and an explanation. This had been constructed, carefully. over time, and I had been the last to know. Before I could think through what my next step should be, there was a knock at the door. Different from the one that morning. Controlled. Measured. Gabriel's voice came through the wood before I could ask. "It's me. Open the door. We don't have much time." I didn't open it immediately. I stood close and asked him how he had known the police would call. His answer came quietly, without hesitation. "Because they're not coming to help you." I opened the door. He stepped inside, scanned the room once, and kept his voice low. He told me that what had happened at my building that morning was not random. That my identity had been used deliberately, not just to create confusion, but to establish a record, a timeline, a story that could be handed to anyone who asked and would hold together under scrutiny. He told me I had been selected as the face of something I had no part in building. I asked him how he knew any of this. He reached into his jacket and placed a small envelope on the kitchen table. He told me my father had given it to him. That my father had asked him, more than a year ago, to move into the neighborhood, to watch over me quietly, to intervene if something like this ever began to take shape. I looked at the envelope for a long moment before I picked it up. My father had passed 3 months earlier. Officially, a stroke. Sudden, unexplained, the kind of loss that arrives without warning and leaves every conversation you never finished feeling like an open door. In the weeks before he died, he had tried to tell me something. He kept saying there were things I needed to know, that it was time. I told him we would talk soon. We always said soon. We never had that conversation. I opened the envelope. His handwriting was exactly as I remembered it. Small, precise, slightly slanted to the right. He wrote that I was not in danger because of anything I had done, that the danger came from something much older than my choices, that Gabriel could be trusted, that I should not, under any circumstances, surrender myself to anyone who came to the house with authority and urgency, because urgency, in this context, was not concern. It was retrieval. He signed it the way he signed every card he ever gave me. Just Dad. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my pocket. Outside, at the far end of the street, the first unmarked vehicle had turned the corner and was moving slowly toward the house. We left through the back. Gabriel had parked his SUV on the adjacent street, a detail that told me he had thought about this moment long before it arrived. We moved quickly, but without running. Running draws attention. He had said that before we even stepped outside, and the steadiness in his voice made me trust it. As we pulled away, I caught a glimpse through the side mirror of 2 men stepping out of the black sedan in front of my house. They didn't rush. They didn't call out. They moved the way people move when they are certain their target has nowhere to go. They were wrong about that. Gabriel drove in silence for the first several minutes. I didn't fill it. I had learned, somewhere in the blur of the last few hours, that silence was not emptiness. It was the space where clarity could settle if you let it. When he finally spoke, he handed me a tablet from the center console. A file was open on the screen. My name was at the top. Below it, a designation I didn't recognize. Clinical language. Blood markers. Immune response data. Notes about a long-term study, initiated before I was old enough to consent to anything, continued without my knowledge through routine medical appointments I had attended my entire life. I read it twice. Then I asked Gabriel what it meant, in plain language. He told me that my father had been a quiet participant in a federal oversight process. Not an agent, not a contractor, but a private citizen who had stumbled into information he was never meant to find. Medical records that didn't match. Laboratory notations in files that bore my name. Evidence that I had been enrolled, without my parents' knowledge, in a long-term biological study tied to a program that no longer officially existed. When my father began asking questions, doors closed. When he persisted, he was managed. When managing him was no longer sufficient, he was removed. I looked out the window at the highway passing beneath us. I thought about all the routine checkups I had attended without question. The blood draws I never thought to follow up on. The forms my parents signed when I was too young to read them. The ordinary architecture of a life that had, it turned out, been quietly observed from the beginning. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something closer to the sensation of a room coming into focus after years of assuming the blur was just how things looked. Gabriel told me there was a vault, that my father had prepared it years ago, that it contained the documentation needed to make everything visible, not to one person, not to one agency, but to enough channels simultaneously that suppression would become impossible. He told me the choice of what to do with it was mine. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the trees begin to thicken on either side of the road as we turned off the highway, and I thought about my father sitting alone somewhere, writing a letter he hoped I would never need to read, preparing for a moment he hoped would never come. He had done all of it quietly, without recognition, without any certainty that it would matter. That, more than anything, told me what I needed to do. The facility was built into the side of a hill so gradually reclaimed by the surrounding forest that you would never find it unless you already knew where to look. Gabriel parked, and we walked the last 100 yards on foot. The air was colder here, quieter. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty so much as preserved. The entrance was a steel door set flush against the earth, with no signage, no markings, nothing to suggest it was anything other than a forgotten utility access point. Gabriel entered a code. The door released with a sound like a slow exhale. Inside, a single corridor. Concrete walls. Low lighting that flickered once and then held steady, as if the building was remembering how to be inhabited. At the end of the corridor was the vault. What stopped me was not the door itself, but what was engraved on it. A small crest I had seen once before, sketched into the margin of an old notebook my father kept on his desk. I had asked him about it when I was young. He told me it was something from the family's history, an old symbol, nothing important. I understood now that everything he had ever called unimportant had been a decision, not a dismissal. Gabriel told me to place my palm on the scanner beside the door. I did. A soft pulse of light moved across my hand. A single tome. Then the vault opened. The room inside was circular and still. Shelves lined with archived materials, all cataloged, all dated. And at the center, on a glass pedestal, my father's journal. I didn't rush toward it. I walked to it the way you approach something you've been given only one opportunity to handle, with the care it deserves. I opened it to the bookmarked page. His letter to me was brief. He had never been a man who used more words than necessary. He wrote that I was not the product of anyone's program or anyone's design, that whatever they had studied in me existed because of who I was, not because of what they had done. That the power in the room around me was not theirs to use, it was mine to decide. At the far end of the vault, a terminal waited. 2 options, clearly labeled, no ambiguity. The first would signal compliance. It would hand over access, confirm the narrative they had constructed, and in exchange offer something that looked like safety, but was, in every meaningful sense, disappearance. The second would release everything. Every file, every record, every name attached to the program, distributed simultaneously across a network of journalists, oversight bodies, and legal channels my father had spent years quietly assembling. I stood at the terminal for a moment that felt longer than it was. I thought about my father's voice the last time we spoke on the phone. How he had said, almost casually, that he was proud of me, that I had always known how to think clearly when it mattered. I had taken it as ordinary affection. Now I understood it had been something else. It had been preparation. I pressed the second option. The terminal hummed. A progress indicator moved steadily across the screen. Somewhere beyond these walls, in offices and inboxes and editorial desks, information was arriving that could not be recalled. Gabriel stood behind me and said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. The alarms began quietly, not the sharp, urgent kind that demand panic. A low, steady tone that moved through the walls of the bunker like a vibration more than a sound. The kind of alarm that means a perimeter has been crossed. A system has registered something it was designed to detect. They had found us. Gabriel moved to the corridor without rushing. I followed, my father's letter still folded in my pocket, the journal tucked under my arm. I had decided, without consciously deciding, that I was not leaving it behind. We exited through a secondary tunnel that emerged into the tree line 40 yards from where we had entered. The night air hit cold and immediate. Above the canopy, I could hear the low rotation of helicopter blades, still distant but closing. Searchlights moved through the branches in long, slow arcs. I watched them for a moment before Gabriel touched my arm, and we moved. There was no dramatic escape, no confrontation. We walked through the forest at a pace that was careful rather than frantic, following a path Gabriel clearly knew, until we reached a secondary road where a second vehicle was waiting. A contact of my father's, someone I didn't know and didn't need to know yet, sat behind the wheel without speaking. We drove. I sat in the back seat and looked out at the road unspooling behind us. The searchlights were no longer visible. The sound of the helicopters faded. What remained was the ordinary darkness of a highway at night, the kind you pass through without remembering. I thought about the woman who had woken up that morning to a knock at her door, who had gone to work every day for a decade at a firm that required precision and reliability, who had built a quiet life and taken careful pride in its structure. She was still me, that hadn't changed, but something had been added to her that morning. Not courage, I don't think that's quite the right word. Something steadier than courage, a kind of orientation. The difference between moving through your life and understanding the direction you are moving in. My father had known this day would come. He had not tried to prevent it. He had tried to prepare me for it, quietly, over years, in ways I had not recognized until they were the only thing I could see. That is its own kind of love, practical and patient and entirely without performance. I didn't know what came next. I knew there would be legal processes, difficult ones. I knew the people whose names were now moving through secure channels toward people equipped to act on them would not accept exposure quietly. I knew my life, as I had organized it, was going to require rebuilding. But I also knew something I had not known the day before. I knew why it had always felt like something was watching. Why certain silences in my life had carried weight they shouldn't have. Why my father looked at me sometimes with an expression I could never quite name. He was looking at someone he had fought to protect. Someone he believed was worth the cost of everything he gave. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the road. There are mornings that feel different before you can explain why. And there are nights when you understand, finally, that the difference was never a warning. It was an arrival.